From the farmer's point of view, actions always speak the loudest, and it's a lesson that we live and personify. I often hear conversations and internal conversations with myself when I think about what's the cost of the work that we do, what's the true cost, what's the return on investment that's not always valued in dollars, and the simple answer is it's all personal. And that's so hard to constantly determine because you're constantly questioning yourself and revaluing what you're doing. As a writer, I often try to work through this through words. And it's part of that, again, confusing and contradictory part, but then again, it was part of my Buddhist upbringing, so I always live with suffering. So that's okay on the farm. But we are caught in a system where, on the one hand, money is overvalued on the farm, and yet at the same time, we live in a food system that's driven by cheap prices. They're contradictory elements when you're trying to work the land. But let me share some quotes from my neighbor farmers in this kind of Farmer Economics 101. These are old sayings of my father and his neighbors. As a farmer, you'll always be land rich and cash poor. Never count your profits during harvest. It will be too depressing. Be prepared to work for under minimum wage. If you want to be rich with money, don't farm. If you want to be wealthy in other ways, farming produces great riches. And to any advice to a young farmer, learn farmer economics. This is all part of this internal economies that I always grapple with, because you do ask yourself, what can you afford to do? What's the investment? But it also leads to the idea of creative economies. And even a premise that Bob once shared with me many years ago, where he talked about the gift economy that's at work in our world in ways that are often undervalued. Finally, let me finish with this fifth premise, and it has to do with art. At the heart and core of what we do and the rise of the food movement is this thing called culinary arts. It's something that in the national art scene, and I happen to be on the National Council of the Arts, which is part of the board of the NEA, it's the idea of looking at food and art as part of that world of art. And what does it mean? It doesn't mean that we're only thinking about sculptures and landscape paintings on the farm. It's about thinking that food isn't always dominated by business. And let me explain about the evolution of farming from the Matsumoto theory. Farmers actually were all artisans at one time. They're small scale, they worked on a very subsistence lifestyle, but they grew the things they ate, they took pride in what they were doing. It's only fairly recently farming has become this profession. You could go to school with it, you could get degrees about it, you study farming. I'm not advocating that we should go back to this peasant type of existence. I don't want to try to ignore the modern technologies and the machinery. I don't want to go back to all hand labor. But we are entering this new phase called the creative entrepreneur. It's a blend of innovation that's part of that business world. Remember I talked about farmer economics, that blend of both human capital, monetary capital, social capital, they're all working together simultaneously. That's part of the new network that farmers and these creative entrepreneurs are plugging into. That's part of the new generation that's taking over the farm. It's the idea of innovation stands right next to tradition as opposed to displacing it. It's about transparency about how food is grown and about our farm going public, which is very, very unique in terms of that dramatic shift in farming. You can see examples of that. I was talking with a friend earlier about how food is part of good health. Food is going to be part of the healthcare system in the future. It's about chaos theory, about how one small farmer could make change that ripples through the system. It's about food not trying to change the world, but be part of a changing world. It's food as a connective tissue, part of that fabric of exchange that we have. Food is communal. How many of you enjoy eating by yourself? Really?
Actually, I do. Yeah.
I could ask why, But in most cases, people enjoy food communally. In most cases, food is shared and it takes on a greater meaning. Maybe that's why some of you are sitting by yourself, too. Food connects us because when you do eat communally, you start thinking about factors in our society, in our world, such as the drought, and how the drought affects my farm, affects food, affects the food that you eat, it affects how you eat the food, the type of communal activity, the social activity you have around food. Suddenly, my drought is your drought, and your drought is my drought. And we're entering this critical phase of the drought, of how the drought is framed into story. And that's the phase we're in right now that's going to determine how public policy evolves out of the drought. So I do believe that we're part of something larger. I do believe there's a new social contract that we're entering into, and it's all about looking toward generations on the land and generations of stories that hopefully you too carry with you. Thank you. You ready for conversation? You want to start?
So now we are so happy to be here with Bob.
So I had a first question for you. You used the word heirloom, which is the title of one of your books, and I was thinking that it might be interesting for you to say what that word means.
Oh, to me, heirloom was this notion of understanding tradition and valuing it, but not in a type of revisionist history. It's looking at the past in the present, and with that, you can move into the future. You have a sense about heirlooms?
Well, I feel like I have to say heirloom is about valuing old things.
Thank you. What do you, as a poet, Bob, you work with words.
Well, I was curious with reading again about your decision to not plow up an orchard of peaches. That the first time that David came and talked to one of our classes, he said to a group of students, "You've never really tasted a peach," and then he passed out, smaller group than this, he passed out peach jam in small quantities, and everybody tasted it and agreed they had never really tasted a peach before until then. And some of that had to do with growing great fruit that was not economically viable, right?
Yeah,
and those belong to the idea of heirloom varieties, that is, not corporate apples,
and
pears.
that were being lost very quickly. And heirlooms, again, is part of saving the past, but it's actually trying to link it to the future, too. You're a poet, Bob. You work with words. When you hear heirlooms, what comes to your mind in that sense?
Families.
Oh, wonderful.
Traditions of families. Put together fruit and heirloom, and I think about seeds handed on from one generation to another. We have a mutual friend, Gary Nabhan, who is concerned about the fact that now 3 or 4 very large corporations control most of the farm seed in the world. And he, who as a student studied the ethnobotany of the Colorado River mouth, where it used to reach, where water actually used to reach the, walked across Italy tracking the seed that was taken from the New World back to the Old World. Corn, beans, so on. Immense varieties that only survived because they were handed from father to son, to daughter, to mother, to father, to son.
And it's interesting when you use a word like heirlooms, and what does it mean? And here's my one, I ponder this a lot. You know, how does the word heirloom fit into public policy? And most people say it doesn't belong at all. But then when you think of issues like drought, and then you think of heirloom meaning family, meaning sense of place and sense of land, how do you value these things? Because they're going to get framed by the words that you use in the public policy sector, as well as a poet and art and a farmer and a writer too.